All right, next up we want to talk about sex-linked inheritance. Now the interesting thing about sex-linked inheritance is that it's also not going to really follow those simple patterns of inheritance. It's going to be a little bit more complicated because the inheritance is going to be directly linked to the sex chromosome. So both males and females have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 of those chromosomes are referred to as autosomes. One pair is going to referred to as the sex chromosome. That sex chromosome is going to be responsible for coding for all of the information needed to make the individual present as male or female. Sex chromosomes are going to differ between the sexes. Males have an X and a Y chromosome, females have two X chromosomes. The Y chromosome contains the genes that's responsible for determining male gender. What we're going to see is that there are quite a few genetic traits that are coded for on the X chromosome that are not coded for on the Y chromosome. So sex-linked traits are controlled by genes on the sex chromosome. An allele on an X chromosome is going to be X-linked, and an allele on the Y chromosome is Y-linked. Most genes on the X chromosomes have no corresponding alleles on the Y chromosome, so these are referred to as the X-linked genes. The Y chromosome is much smaller than the X, and it carries much fewer genes. So X-linked genes, these are going to have a different pattern of inheritance. The recessive phenotype of the X-linked genes is going to be much more common in males because sons can only inherit X-linked recessive only from the mother, or can inherit the X-linked recessive only from the mother. There are quite a few examples of these disorders, like red-green color blindness, 2 different forms of hemophilia, Duchenne muscular dystrophy is all going to be inherited and passed down through that X-linked chromosome. A male is always going to receive an X-linked allele from his mother, from whom he inherited the X chromosome. So usually sex-linked disorders are going to be recessive, therefore the female must receive 2 alleles, one from each parent, before she has the disorder. So if the trait is going to be linked to the X chromosome, males can only pass it down, or males can only receive it from their mothers. So that's the interesting thing about X-linked traits, is you're typically going to see them passed from mothers to sons to daughters to sons to daughter, like so on and so forth. They're going to be passed down male, female through the lineage. Now they can be passed down through the other females, but well, we'll talk through this. There's going to be a couple of interesting cases that we're going to go through. So one of the main examples that we're going to talk about quite a bit is red-green color blindness. And the reason that we talk about this is mostly just because I have so many examples from my family. So in the case of color blindness, this is how we are going to denote the genotypes. So an individual who has normal color vision is going to be indicated by a capital B. Now this trait can only be located on the X chromosome. So you'll see that when we are denoting the X chromosomes, we have to indicate whether they are dominant or recessive for that particular trait. Y chromosomes will not have that big B or little b, because the Y chromosomes don't carry this trait. So there's no way to denote them. This is going to be very important as you're working through your lab packets. When you're doing X and Y, or when you're dealing with X-linked traits, it's important that you do indicate everything correctly. You should be indicating by the use of X and Y chromosomes. You don't indicate with big B, little b alone. You indicate with an X prime, X naught, or XB, X little b. You indicate it with the chromosome that is carrying the gene, and then the gene that that chromosome is carrying. So just as an example of the different phenotypes. Although female carriers appear normal, they can pass on the allele for color blindness. So here we have a female who has normal color vision. Here we have a female who has normal color vision, but she is a carrier. So although she completely has normal color vision, she is going to be a carrier for this trait because this chromosome right here does have the recessive allele. A female who has 2 recessive alleles on both X chromosomes is going to be colorblind. Males who have the, oops, I'm losing my mouse. Males who have the gene for the normal phenotype are going to have normal color vision. Males who have the recessive gene are going to be colorblind. In the case of an X-linked allele, there's no such thing as a male who is a carrier only. If he has the dominant allele, he has normal color vision and is not a carrier. If he has the recessive allele, he is colorblind and is not considered a carrier. He just is colorblind. And of course, we'll pass it on to his offspring, but it's not a carrier with a normal phenotype. So in order to be colorblind, females must have the allele from both parents. In order to be colorblind, males only have to inherit it from one parent. It'll have to be inherited from their mother because it comes on the X chromosome. Males are only going to inherit the Y chromosome from their father, so they cannot inherit colorblindness from their father. The inheritance of a Y from a father cannot offset the inheritance of a colorblind or a recessive X chromosome from the mother. So an individual who is recessive for the colorblindness trait, a male who is recessive for the colorblindness trait, will be colorblind. Specifically this red-green colorblindness that we are discussing. So here's an example of the results of an X-linked cross. So here we have a dominant male, so a normal, healthy, non-colorblind male, and we have a carrier, a colorblind carrier mother or female. So what we end up with is if this individual was to cross, if the father passes down his X chromosome, this is a completely healthy chromosome. X chromosome does not have the gene for colorblindness. If he were to cross with the female, they would have an individual who is homozygous dominant for colorblindness. Any males that they have would cross, or the males, there is also the potential that they would have a male who is going to be inherit this X from mom and the Y from dad. This individual would not be colorblind. In this case, we're inheriting this X from dad, so a healthy, normal X from dad, and a colorblind X from mom. We're going to end up with a daughter who is a carrier. In the event that they inherit Y from dad and this recessive X from mom, they're going to be colorblind. So what we're going to see here is if we have a normal male crossed with a carrier female, the daughters will not be colorblind. They will have normal vision, but there's a 50-50 chance that the daughters will be carriers. The sons will not be carriers. The sons will either be colorblind, or normal vision. They have a 50-50 chance of being normal versus colorblind. So this is how an X-linked trait kind of gets passed around. Like I said, when we meet in person, we're going to spend a lot of time going over practice problems. We'll spend quite a bit of time with X-linked traits just because it's going to appear quite a bit in your labs. So don't worry, we will spend a lot of time reviewing X-linked traits and X-linked disorders. So an X-linked recessive disorder, more males than females are going to have it because the recessive alleles on the X chromosome will always be expressed in the males. The Y chromosome is going to lack any allele for the disorder, so the Y chromosome can't have, a dominant normal trait because it just doesn't have the allele altogether. X-linked recessive conditions often pass from grandfather to grandson because the daughters of a male within the disorder tend to be carriers. So, I'll get into examples when we meet in person. My grandfather was colorblind, and so he was able to then, because my grandfather was colorblind, he was then able to pass colorblindness down to his daughters. However, he did not pass it down to his sons. So, because it's an X-linked disorder. It's located on his X chromosome. He could contribute an X chromosome to his daughter. He did not contribute an X chromosome to either of his sons. So my aunt is a carrier for colorblindness. Now she went on to have a son. Because she is a carrier and her husband is not, her son has a 50-50 chance of being colorblind. Now we already know that he is not. So he is not colorblind and he is not a carrier for it. Her daughter, on the other hand, has a 50-50 chance of being a carrier for color blindness. Because, so if we back up here, her mother, my aunt, is a carrier. My uncle does not have color blindness. Therefore, her daughter has a 50-50 chance of being a carrier, and her son has a 50-50 chance of being colorblind. So X-linked dominant traits. X-linked dominant traits are going to affect, in this case, affected males are going to pass the traits on to their daughters, who are going to have a 100% chance of having the condition. Females can pass X-linked dominant alleles to both their sons and their daughters. So there are a couple of X-linked recessive disorders, so I'm just going to mention a few of those. We'll go through quite a few of them in our lab time, but I'm going to just mention them for now. Like I said, color blindness, the inability to differentiate between certain colors. Some forms, like the red-green color blindness, is going to be X-linked. There's no treatment for it. It affects about 10% of Caucasian males and about 5% of Caucasian, and about 0.5% of Caucasian females in the United States. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is also an X-linked recessive trait. This results in the degeneration of muscles, a waddling gait, toe walking, frequent falls, difficulty in rising after a fall. It's typically going to progress until the individual is confined to a wheelchair, normally by ages 7 to 10. Death usually occurs between the ages of 20 and 22. Affected males are rarely fathers. The allele is going to remain in the population through the passage of carrier mother to carrier daughter. Fragile X syndrome is also an X-linked recessive disorder. It's going to be the most common cause of mental impairment. The impairment varies in severity, but it is the most common known cause of autism. There's a lot that is still unknown about autism, but the most common cause of it is this X-linked Fragile X syndrome. Characteristics, there are a few characteristic physical abnormalities like a prominent jaw, flexible joints. There are a few genital abnormalities. Typically also a dislike of being touched, poor eye contact, repetitive speech patterns, hand flapping. All of those can be associated with the Fragile X syndrome. Hemophilia is also an X-linked recessive disorder. There are two common types, hemophilia A and hemophilia B, and it just has to do with the absence of particular clotting factors that determines A versus B. In this case, blood does not clot well. Hemorrhages can be stopped with transfusions of fresh blood or plasma, or you can also transfuse the clotting protein. One thing that's interesting, if you've ever studied history, especially the royal families of Europe, you will notice or hear about hemophilia. Hemophilia is a blood disorder that was passed around quite a bit in the royal family. The most prominent case would be of Alexei, the youngest son of Tsar Nicholas, the last Tsar of Russia. So Anastasia, if you know Anastasia, her little brother had hemophilia. It was passed down from his mother, who was a carrier. His mother, of course, was related to Queen Victoria. The royal families have a tendency to marry and stay within the family, which means genetic disorders have a tendency to get passed around quite a bit. Lots of cousins marrying cousins over there. So what you'll see, so if you ever look at a family tree of Queen Victoria, it's interesting to trace the pedigree of that family line and see the appearance of the hemophilia as it got passed around the royal family. Anyway, that is another topic for another time. But that's hemophilia, an X-linked recessive disorder. So after this section, you should be able to solve problems like the following. In a given family, a man and woman have 2 children, a boy and a girl. Both are colorblind. List the possible genotypes of the parents if both parents have normal vision. All right. So, and then also, can a woman who is affected by an X-linked dominant disorder have a child who is not affected by an X-linked dominant disorder? Why or why not? And then you should also be able to discuss why X-linked disorders are much more common than Y-linked disorders. And that's just sort of a discussion question, but I want to encourage you to think about that and bring your answers to our weekly meetings. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I'll be happy to go over anything. We will spend quite a bit of time in our live discussion times going over Punnett squares. We will spend quite a bit of time with Punnett squares and practice genetic problems. So come prepared.